Welcome to Keith Herrschaft's Midnight Cartoon Program.
Welcome to the show, and thank you for coming back. Last week's episode was undeniably terrible, and I blame the poor quality of the show entirely on my producer. Isn't that right, Phil? I don't think he's breathing. But that's fine, because tonight's episode is going to be completely different. I'm in charge. How do you like that, Phil? He's definitely not breathing. In any case, the rest of my crew seems healthy and breathing just fine. So in tonight's episode, we're going to be looking more deeply into a subject that I touched on last week, but I didn't get to explore as deeply or as thoroughly as I would have liked. It's the core of figure drawing and character drawing. It's the gesture. What I'd like to... Cue cards. Lift the cue cards up. I can't read them if they're facing the ground. Nice. No, you're doing a great job. Anyway, I'm still excited about tonight's episode. Just yesterday, I gave a portion of the budget to my intern, the guy who can't seem to handle cue cards, and I tasked him with finding us a live model for tonight's episode. So, I would like to introduce I think I might be drawing from memory tonight. No. Stay. Please. You're my muse. Alright, I'm excited again. So the cameras are rolling. The studio audience is getting restless. Without further ado, let's get to some cartoons. So we're going to start with what I'm going to call the gesture language. It's just sort of a visual shorthand. It's going to start roughing in like the props. I did a box here, and the pose is just a character leaning against it. And that's really all this stage is you're just thinking about how the character's interacting with their environment, the basic action. The main thing I'm thinking of right now is just keeping it simple and try to work light to dark. So think primarily about the broad movements of anatomy. You're not thinking about fingers, you're just sort of thinking about the overall shape of the thing. Just break things like that down to their most simple forms. The first thing I usually start with is the head, and I like to figure out which direction it's pointing. Work out the very loose anatomy of it. It'll make it easier when you go into lay the details. Then I move down to the torso and the hips, and I think about those two as just large objects. George Bridgman covers this really well, and the way I draw is taken from him. Keeps it nice and simple, and you can twist them to kind of give a more interesting pose. And then you also think about whether they're pointing up or down. So it kind of gives you an idea of whether, when you're laying details across the surface, whether the lines would curve up or down as they're crossing that surface plane. Gives a lot more believability and depth to your details. Moving on to the next section, I wanted to do a few full body gestures to give you an idea of how I go through breaking the process down. Again, I start with the head. figure out the direction by putting the grid across the eyes, rib cage, hips, and then down to the legs, and you just rough it in real loose. I like to place the hands in the action and then build that connection to the torso. It's a little easier to figure out the layout of it and keep the acting loose. You can see I put a lot of the weight on the back leg and then use the front leg as a support. The main thing I'm thinking about here is trying to keep the figure balanced. Keeping that's one of the main things to focus on in the gesture, is trying to make sure the pose feels right. So here I'll start on a reclined pose. You can see the lines I'm laying across the surface of the chest and the hips. It's starting to suggest, whether the object's coming forward to you or away from you, and I'm placing objects in front of other objects to push the idea of depth. You can see it in the placement of the knee and the leg. When objects obscure other objects, it's one of many ways to push the idea that the object is three-dimensional. I also use this as an opportunity to start roughing in certain shapes for, like the hair and things like that, just to kind of get an idea of how it's placed. And if you're doing a comic panel, draw through. Use the same principles, but like loosely sketch over the panel border. It gives you a better idea of where things go in and out of the panel. It makes it feel more solid. Whereas if you try to draw it just where the panel ends, the anatomy might not be correct. Going a bit deeper into the idea of pushing shapes in front of one another to give depth. Here's another example of it. If the character was sort of laying down, you can see I really overlapped the shape of the rib cage, the torso, over the hips, and then did the same with the head over the chest, and it really pushes that idea of the character receding in space. Also, think about the shapes that you're creating. Again, back to George Bridgman's book, he calls this like rhythm. So you have like a certain rhythm in the line, and I also think of the shape contrast. Try to oppose straight lines with curved lines, and just gives it a more interesting appearance. And moving on to the next portion, I want to take those same ideas of gesture and apply them to more cartooned characters. So here I have some sort of ogreish sort of gesture of a character, playing with the shape contrast, putting the smaller head, smaller legs with the oversized torso and rib cage. Remember to draw through. So you want to keep sketching, keep it loose. Don't just stop your lines. Work real loose and light, and just build up those shapes. As I go through, I'm still thinking, which direction things are pointing. So, I'm curving the surface lines to that to try and suggest more volume. Straights versus curves again, and parts on the forearm too. I try to create, a nice angle on the inside of the arm against the softer curve of the outside. And the way that I'm overlapping those shapes, I turn that longer shape of the forearm into a circle, into a more circular shape. Gives it more of the sense that it's coming forward. Pushing those shape designs in the opposite direction, I'll do him with a massive head and a real thin body. It's taking the idea of shape contrast to the opposite direction, and I try to keep his pose loose and realistic. Just thinking, what's he doing with the other character? Since I drew him close, I figured I'd make them interact. Just sort of a goofy guy saying howdy. He's got his hand in his pocket, just trying to make him look kind of casual, and the other guy just doesn't know how to deal with him. Okay, so the next character, go with a totally different shape. Kind of build this guy out of like a rectangle. Think of it like a cube. Building up volume. Trying to think about what the character looks like in 3-dimensional space, and trying to give him an emotion. This guy's mad and he's kicking a can, probably because it reminds him of himself, and he, I don't know, maybe he hates himself, but he's kicking that can, getting those frustrations out. When you have a character interacting with an object like that, you can apply the gesture to the object too. So here's a flat can, and then here is one that suggests more movement. I have it sort of breaking in the center, going with a real sharp angle on the inside and a real stretched out curve on the outside, and you have it breaking across the point of impact. It suggests it moving forward. So one of the other things I usually start with is trying to figure out, I start with the head, and then I like to lay in a little bit of the face and put some emotion into it. So the difference between these two characters, you can immediately tell I've stretched this one out to get him so he looks like he's surprised, whereas the other guy, I've turned his eyebrows in and I have him pointing real aggressively forward. So now you can kind of start to build the rest of the pose off of the emotion that you've established, and you can kind of suggest movement too. Like this guy, he's going to look like he's turning around real quick. The way he's looking over the shoulder, the way his arms just sort of posed midair, it suggests his head's turning. So think about the emotion and the acting too. And here's the final segment. I thought this would be good to show a drawing going from a blank piece of paper all the way to a finished piece. I'll be going through the 3 main stages that I mentioned in last week's video. The gesture stage, the structure and early refinement, and then the cleanup and the detail. I'll go more into the following stages in future videos, but it's not bad to kind of start seeing it now, just so you have an idea of how I go through a drawing, what the steps in my process are. This video, I think the full clip, if I hadn't sped it up, I think it was about 19 minutes long. So it gives you an idea of proportionately how much time I spend on the gesture when I start to move into the next stages of detail. The characters from one of my comics, I'll put a link in the description where you can go and check it out. The story focuses on a few degenerates in a cyberpunk dystopian wasteland. They wind up in an asylum out in the middle of nowhere, so that's why the drawing here, the subject, doesn't make much logical sense, but it's fun to draw. So just keep an eye on how I'm putting the details in. I'm following the surface the surface information that I laid out in the earlier stages, and just trying to make the figure seem like she has some volume and depth. I'll let the rest of the video play out. Thanks for stopping by and checking it out, and I'm looking forward to trying to put another one of these videos out next week.